Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this evening's APM webinar that's been brought to you by the APM Thames Valley branch. My name is Robert Allen. I'm the APM branches manager, and I'm delighted to see so many of you with us tonight. I hope you're all keeping well. It's certainly hot at the moment, so hopefully you're somewhere with a nice breeze and keeping cool this evening. I'm delighted that Richard from Mott MacDonald has joined us again this evening to share more on NEC. Richard's going to talk more about this in the near future, but Richard has kindly given up his time to give a series on NEC. I'd like to point you in the direction of the handout section. Richard has kindly provided a copy of his little book of NEC, so please feel free to download that. We'll be doing a couple of Slidos throughout tonight, so get involved. But equally, if you have any questions, please submit those in your control panel. And what I'll do is I'll engage with Richard throughout the session and pose your questions to him. So Richard, over to you, and thank you.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Robert. So welcome everybody, as we've just said. This is a second in a series of these things as we'll talk about just now. So today is quite a lot of detail. It's more detail. It's all the detail that I normally give when giving NEC training specifically on program. And obviously for project managers, I'd like to think that you're interested in program. You might be interested in the contract which has the most to say about program of any construction contract on the planet. If not, you might as well go away because it's going to be very dull. So that's me as a pretty picture. There I am in my smart presenting shirt on. I'm afraid I'm in a scruffy t-shirt tonight. So I've been with Mott MacDonald for only 32 years. 25 years of that has been focused on NEC. I am a civil engineer. I'm a fellow of the ICE. And that's all basically based on my NEC expertise. I used to be a dams engineer, so I'm a civil engineer by background, but I've been doing contracts for the last 25 years or so. Internationally, I do contracts mainly for our water team in Mott MacDonald, and many of those have to be with an international form of contract, which is a competitor to NEC. So I do see other ways of doing things as well. So back to the Slido stuff. I think this is where we switch screens between myself and Robert. So Robert, if you please engage with the Slido stuff, and we'll put together a screen. I think we can show you where you're saying you're coming in from. Big in the middle is West Midlands, so I presume that's a lot of people saying you're from West Midlands, but we've got people from Falkirk and from High YouTube, which is good. You're from all over the place, which is handy. Slip back to my presentation. I think we have to go again. We have to press a button or something. I'm just looking for that. There we go, showing my screen. Oh, so slick, it's wonderful. So this is a slide that we have of the internal Mott MacDonald so-called bite-sized sessions on NEC. And funnily enough, I did this one as a practice for you guys. I did it on the 14th across Mott MacDonald and with some clients. But for today, this is the second in this particular series that APM has asked me to put on. We had that intro one, which was a couple of weeks ago, which is there on the web if you want it. And these are the specific aspects of NEC we're looking to do throughout the rest of the year. So if you are interested, get the dates in your diary. So back to Slido, and what industry do you work in to start with? And I think, again, we flick back between the pair of us. And so Robert's going to show what you're saying in response to that answer. What do you do? What industry are you in? A lot of people in rail. IT is good to see. I'm in the construction industry. I'm a civil engineer, as I just told you, so I tend to see the world through a construction lens. But don't forget, it's not only contracts, construction, sorry. You can use NEC contracts for pretty much any project that you want to get done. The contract generally is a contract for a project. And we'll talk about that as we go through. This session today on program, it's not only about the construction contract. Everything I say today is, nearly everything I said today is equally valid for the NEC's professional services contract. Okay, so Robert, you might want to move on. We've got the general gist. We're in a whole range of industries and sectors. Then we've just said, who do you work for? Is it an ultimate client or a consultant or a contractor or a subcontractor? I suppose we should have had anything else. And immediately, as always, it's the consultants that come out on at 6 o'clock on an evening to listen to this sort of stuff. And as we always find, unsurprisingly, it's always difficult to engage the subcontractors on this sort of presentation. One of the problems, one of the issues with NEC generally is that the subcontractor sector, they just don't have time or the budget to really get involved with this. And next, NEC experience. Where are we starting from today? Let's have a look. And I put this in these 4 categories, which you can hopefully read and understand. Where do you think you sit on this picture? Interesting. Obviously, it's bumping up and down as it's all very wonderfully interactive, isn't it? So there's 10% of you or 5% of you who actually go out there and give advice on NEC, for whom today's session will be a piece of cake because you know it already and you probably do it for other people. But we get, as ever, whenever I give training, there's a big range of levels of expertise, which reinforces the need for you, please, to ask questions and to slow me down and say, Richard, what the hell are you talking about? Moving on, next question. Programming. How important is it to you? Gradually, I think, moving down to the board as to how much you're doing this as part of your day job. Interesting to see, 21 people. Don't know how many people we've got online altogether, but maybe Robert can tell me, but whatever. 27 people have put in their Slido. So all of us, not all of us, a large percentage of us will see and use programs, because obviously these are adding to each other. Only 10% here is saying it's not part of your job. So we use programming, something quite important. Okay, Robert, let me have the screen back and we'll get on with it. The real stuff, the real detail, the meat. So I start off by saying, as Martin Barnes, who was the initiator of NEC 20, 30 years ago, he was a project manager. He was the lifetime president of this institution, the APM. So fundamentally, we can only learn from the past, but we can only manage what's got to be done. We can manage the future. And to do that, program is obviously going to be key. And as you'll see tonight, NEC has got by far the most detailed and active program requirements of any contract you will ever have seen. And why is the program so important? Simplistically, we need a plan. We want to know what's happening and where we're getting on and who needs to see what when. We want to see a program for what's happening on a construction site or for any project. But from a commercial contractual point of view, the key clause is in front of you. When it comes to assessing what NEC calls a compensation event, which is the mechanism that NEC has for allowing the contractor any extra time and or money, the contractor has to finish by a date called the completion date, and a delay to that completion date is assessed as the length of time due to the compensation event. Planned completion is now later than planned completion as shown on the accepted program. That's the program that's been accepted by the project manager and is the routinely updated beast that we're going to use for managing our contract. What I didn't say at the start, on these slides, where there's something which is new for the NEC 4th edition, I've shown that in the purple text. And in the purple text, you'll see at the end of it, this is a new change. It was already sort of there, but it's now much more explicit. It's what the program that we use to do this assessment is the one that was current at the dividing date. And we'll talk about the dividing date on a further slide later on. So fundamentally, if we haven't got a program, we've got no means of managing the completion date and therefore keeping track of when completion is actually required, which you as project managers would say is a fairly ridiculous position to find ourselves in. If we don't have a program from the contractor, there's provisions in the contract which says, oh, well, the project manager is going to have to assess how much delay you get. If you're not going to bother to update your program, you're going to rely on the project manager deciding how much delay you get. Fair enough. But contractors generally don't like that. And as soon as the project manager starts using that clause in the contract, you'll find suddenly the contractor puts a bit more effort into getting a program good enough to be accepted. So, accepted program, as I've already hopefully explained to you, is key for an NEC contract. But the first one, it hasn't got any mythical, magical status. Some of you might be old enough to remember the old ICE, Institution of Civil Engineers Conditions of Contract, where there was this mythical Clause 14 program. That was the first program, and everything was based on the first program. NEC doesn't do it like this, and you can see this, the words in red. The latest program accepted by the project manager supersedes previous accepted programs. Simple, clear statement. In terms of getting the first program into existence, the client, okay, even the language has changed. NEC 3 was employer, NEC 4 is client. Doesn't really matter, it's just a language change. The client can either ask for a program, which then becomes the accepted program from all the bidders. And if so, that program, once it is reviewed and then effectively bound into the contract, it's referred to from a part of the contract called the contract data part 2. We can either do that, or we can say, oh, that's too hard. It's unreasonable to ask all the bidders to do that. I'll just ask for a program from the contractor, the person that has been appointed, within however many weeks we want to say from the contract date. Now, the contract date is the date when the contract actually becomes effective. In other words, the date when we have a letter of acceptance. Hopefully that's clear. Any questions? Please ask. Again, that first program has got no specific special status. It's just a starting point, and we'll move on. If you're interested in that particular aspect of it, I am a bit of a sad NEC specialist, and when I see there's a gap in the market, I write something. And there's a link there to a little article we wrote in the NEC newsletter, specifically looking at the pros and cons of that decision, how to go about getting that first program in place. Too much detail for tonight's presentation. So, simple obligations, starting at the bottom. Clause 30.1 says the contractor does the work so that completion is on or before the completion date. Now, NEC likes to be concise, likes to be clear, but I tell you now, it would have been a lot nicer if NEC had called the completion date, if we'd called it the required completion date, because as you can see from that definition, or from that clause, the completion date is when we're required to achieve completion, when we, the contractor, is required to achieve completion. We've got another date called the access date, which is when the client is required to give the contractor access to the site to allow them to get on and start doing the work. At the end of the day, it's the project manager's job, that's you, to decide the date of completion and certify it. What I haven't mentioned yet, I might as well do it now. You see there, that's the project manager in italics. I like to talk in italics. I'm not sure whether it's that way or that way. The project manager in italics is the entity in the ECC contract that does things. So you've got to understand there's a difference between the project manager in italics and any other character that might think they call themselves a project manager. I call myself a project manager for my little training projects, but that's very different from the ECC's project manager. Other contracts have different names for that person. So JCT calls it, I think, the contract administrator, and FIDIC calls it the engineer. In our contract, the person doing this stuff on behalf of the client is called the project manager. Importantly, the client has got obligations too, and that list of compensation events, which are the events that the contractor can claim extra time or money for, includes simple. The employer, the client, does not give access to the site. The employer does not provide something which they've flipping well said they were going to provide by the date shown on the accepted program. And quite an important one, the client or others do not work within the times shown on the accepted program. Now, might be too much detail for tonight, but I'm going to say it anyway. Others is a defined term. You can see it's got a capital letter, And others is effectively third parties. They're people that aren't the contractor or subcontractor or project manager or client. So those others might include, for example, and most importantly, utility companies. Quite often, certainly on construction projects, I saw the labels of rail and whatever at the start. Quite often we ask the main contractor to coordinate the work of the utilities to move the power or shift the water. Those others include utilities, and therefore find the contractor coordinates them, but if they don't actually do what they've said they're going to do on the program, then 60.15 compensation event. In other words, the work of those others is at the risk of the client. That's quite an important point to be aware of, which is why I've shown it on a little box. Look, I've already thought about that. Nice slide here for all the dates to get your head around the language of the NEC. Contract date, when the contract came into existence. Starting date, when the contractor can get started, when the contractor has got some risks, and therefore when the contractor is required to show you that they've got some insurance in place. Access date, we've already mentioned, when the client provides access to a part of the site. Completion, I don't know why I've got that, and my animation's not great here. Completion, try and get in your head, is a state and not a date. Completion is when the contractor has done what's required by the scope document for the completion date. That's when completion has happened, but it's not a date in itself. It is just a state. In contrast, the completion date in italics, this is an NEC bit of language that you'll have to get used to if you need to get to know NEC. If it's in italics, that means all of these dates here in italics means they're stated in the document called the contract data. So when this contractor signed up to do this job, they signed up to deliver completion by the completion date in italics. But we also have the completion date. There's a lovely term in NEC. The definition of completion date says the completion date is the completion date unless changed in accordance with the contract. Because it's changed, the required date to achieve completion starts off in italics as a hard-coded date in the contract data, but as we go through the job, that date will move, and it typically moves to the right because of compensation events. There are mechanisms for it to come forwards because either of acceleration or as part of a deal for the contractor to say, oh, come on, can you let me off correcting that defect? That's a real pain. How about I promise to finish a couple of days earlier if you let me off? That's a mechanism for accepting defects in the contract. The contractor's got to show all these dates on their program. They've also got to show planned completion. So that will be at the end of the contractor's critical path, as shown on the pictures there. Planned completion, as we've just seen, is the date we use to assess the effect of compensation events, so it's critical. But this is just when the contractor says they're going to achieve the nirvana state of completion. And as you can see on the picture, that might well be before when they're required to achieve completion. So these are two very different dates. We've also got a date of completion. That's the actual date certified by the project manager. I'll give you all the clause numbers on here. That's when the project manager certifies and says formally, yes, Mr. Contractor, you did achieve all the things required for completion. After that, there's takeover. After that, there's a thing called the defects date, which is when we stop being able to notify defects. We've also got a thing called a key date, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And as I said, everything in italics is an entry in this document called the contract data. And if we have a sectional completion option, then all of these blue things are specific, yes, for the whole of the works, but also for each individual section. Now, at this point in my normal training, just to wake people up, I say, okay, so now are you happy to explain to a new graduate the difference between completion, completion date, plan completion, date of completion? I hope so, because it's all on the slide. But if you haven't picked that up, have another look at the slide and make sure you can understand the subtle difference between those 5 different terms. They all include the word completion, but ironically, they all mean, wait for it, completely different things. So you've got to understand what's on this slide before probably the rest of this presentation makes any sense. If you've got any questions, please fire them in. And as I said earlier, most of this presentation also applies to the professional services contract, and everything on the slide applies to the professional services contract, except we don't need an access date and there is no concept of takeover. Everything else is exactly the same. The wording, the clauses, the clause numbers might tweak a little bit, but otherwise the processes are all exactly the same. So changes to completion date, I've probably said this already, can only be changed by the project manager as a result of compensation events, acceleration, or accepting a defect. That's the only way that date is going to change. And the most important ones is based on, as I said, for compensation events, is based on the effect on planned completion as per the accepted program. Okay, step back. What's in the program? Well, the answer is an awful lot. An awful lot. Now, I don't know whether I can do this. I probably could do it. Should I do it tonight? I don't know. Maybe not. I might just once in a while, I might just to make this presentation slightly more interactive, I'll do what I can do. Thankfully, because I work for Mott MacDonald, I can just pull up all the NEC contracts electronically. And then once in a while in the presentation, just to make it slightly less dull, well, actually, I don't know, looking at a contract, is that less dull or more dull? You might tell me it's more dull, but I like to think it's important because when you're giving training, it's important that you actually go and show people the real story. So all I need to do is a Control F, 31.2, because I'm sad and I know the clause number. 31.2 is a great long shopping list for what's in the program. So if you do NEC, your planners, your programmers, they need to look at that clause in some detail. What's in the program? Go down the page a little bit further, and you've also got what's also got to be shown on revised programs. So very, very clear, but you need to read the contract. Back to the summary on the slide, I guess. 31.2. Latest one accepted by the project manager includes various dates, order and timing. So that's the bar chart stuff. That's the network that you need for these planned operations. Order and timing of the work of the client and others. And a lovely little line, as last agreed with them. So you can't just dump a whole load of client obligations on the program. You can only do that if you have agreed those with them. Plan dates to achieve the conditions. We haven't talked about that yet. Those are the conditions required for those key dates. Also, they've got to show provisions for float and time risk allowance, detail coming later. And dates when the contractor will need access, acceptances, and anything to be provided, as stated in the contract, anything provided by the client, and any information required from others. So if you're working for a contractor or a supplier, hopefully it's blindingly obvious that it's commercially good sense to use the program to show when you need these things from others and from the client, because commercially, if they don't, ka-ching, compensation event. And also, critically, going back to the last 2 bullet points now, for each operation, a statement of how the contractor plans to do the work, a statement of how. So that's a little bit of a narrative. And also the principal equipment and other resources which he plans to use. Now that's wording which says it's effectively we want a resource-based program. So if you're using Primavera P6 or if you're particularly hot with MS Project, you can show those resources within the software. Otherwise, contractors with a little job might get away with showing the resources on a little spreadsheet, in which case the program itself is a collection of those 3 documents. The Gantt chart to show order and timing, resources, and a little bit of a narrative as to how we're going to do the job. That's what needs to be in the program. And there's only one program. All of these things which get talked about, they all need to be included on the NEC program. Okay, so there's a lot of work to this, and you'll soon see, hopefully, that you cannot do NEC without some fairly serious program skills. Program includes time risk allowances. Now, most of us are used to the idea of having a risk allowance in cost estimates. NEC is the only contract on the planet to even mention the concept of time risk allowances. Now, the only function of those time risk allowances, which are owned by the contractor, is to help demonstrate to the project manager that their program is realistic. If the program is totally based on everything working properly, all at the contractor's high productivity rate, because we always lay 220 meters of pipeline per day, well, hang on, what if it's pouring down with rain? Should we have a risk allowance in that program duration? NEC says yes and calls it a time risk allowance. Typically, those aren't shown as specific bars on the program, but they should be shown as a data in the program, typically in a data column supporting the P6 or the MS project data that is shown as the submission data to the project manager. Some of you will have come across what we call collaborative planning. This is the all in it together programs on a post-it note. It's all wonderfully collaborative. And I'll be honest, I've never been involved in one of those. I'll be quite honest, because I do NEC. I'm an NEC nerd. People tell me in that sort of critical chain project management tends to put the time risk allowances at the end of a chain of operation rather than on each of the operations in the program. I just want to tell you that as far as NEC, the word NEC, it just says you have to show time risk allowance. I think if you as a client specifically want that to be shown on each and every operation, you would probably need to amend the contract to state that explicitly. That's a real detail, but hey, we're here for details. When it comes to accepting the program, so you're the project manager, you've just received this NEC program with all that detail, you've got precisely 2 weeks to either accept it or not accept it. And if you want to not accept it, you really should be well advised to state one of the stated reasons for not accepting, which is what the contract gives you. And these are the 4 reasons, and 2 of them are pretty fluffy, practicable or realistic. And that's where we say you need to talk to each other. We need to have a routine program meeting for the contractor to use to help demonstrate to the project manager that this program is indeed practicable and realistic. I would argue it's really difficult just to do that with an exchange of emails. I'd like to hear your thoughts on that. Also, the program has got to show the information which the contract requires, which is what I've just shown you. And also we can not accept it if it doesn't comply with any constraint stated in the what used to be called the works information in EC3. It's now called the scope. Robert, give me a question. I'm bored with myself already. There must be a question coming in.
There is. So I'm going to read it out word for word if that's okay. So Brian has said, after commencing the contract, and then in brackets C, agrees with the S-C to use the C's program with outputs for the S/C to use to submit their C131 program. This is done. C rejects on the grounds that the SC's plans aren't realistic, basically wanting better productivity on the SC program as CEs have happened in the meantime. What happens if SC refuses and relies on the previous agreement, no agreed CI 31 and no baseline to implications of CE? Is it better for SC just to agree to get a better baseline?
Okay, well, we can award a prize for the length of question. That was good stuff. SC, I'm guessing, is obviously subcontractor. So one thing that I haven't mentioned, but it's really good to raise it, is that, again, NEC as a family of documents also has an engineering construction subcontract. And again, all of these clauses are passed down straightforwardly from the construction contract to the subcontractor. Now, and that's a real issue, because in our construction world, we find firstly, many contractors aren't resourced well enough to comply with these programming requirements, and very definitely many subcontractors are also not resourced well enough to comply with these requirements. Contractors, main contractors, this is slightly off the run of things here. Main contractors might well be advised to have a look at the NEC construction short subcontract, which doesn't have the same level of requirement when it comes to program. Going back to the detail of the question, I'm hoping some of that will be picked up again when we come through to the rest of the detail in the program, and then we'll come back to that. But the basic gist is we should be using the last accepted program, and we'll see in a later presentation as I get through it how we use that to assess the compensation event. And as I've just said, that will be exactly the same between a main contractor and a subcontractor. So I'm sort of going to pass on the detail of that answer. I'm sorry, that's me wimping out. Robert?
I'm back, and I'm back with a shorter question. So John has said, what are your thoughts on the 31.2 requirement for provision for the procedure set out in the contract?
Okay, really good question. So a really open clause in the contract. So 31.2 we're talking about, the stuff is got to include provisions for the procedures set out in this contract. Now, there could be a million procedures set out in your contract and in the scope and in here. So the most obvious one, and it's really this overlaps with here, is acceptances. So very clearly, the contractor, if the contractor is doing any design, there will be maybe 100 different submissions of documents required by the scope. And the contractor should show on their program when those are going to be submitted and when the contractor is required to show acceptances. The best answer to John's question is we have to have a little bit of realism, because if the project manager wants to see every single procedure shown in the program, the program will become so ridiculously burdensome, it's no good for anybody. So there has to be a little bit of pragmatism about how far we take the detail. I think it's my best answer for that question. Whether that's going to keep John happy, I'm not sure. He can come back with a retort.
Yeah, John, certainly let us know if you need additional information. I'm going to move to Ben's question. As a project progresses, if the contractor finishes a task/activity on the critical path early, what would happen to any time risk allowance associated with that task/activity?
Brilliant question.
Would planned completion be shown prior to the completion date? And if so, who would own the terminal float?
Okay, brilliant question. Very simple answer. So it's shown on, again, it's shown in more detail on a slide coming later, but ultimately that time risk allowance is owned by the contractor. And if it's on a critical path activity, when we update the program, it will show that the planned completion will come forward because we didn't need that time risk allowance. If the planned completion comes forward, remember that's very separate from the required completion date, and therefore by bringing forward planned completion, we will increase the terminal float, which is that period that the planners call, the word terminal float is used for the period between planned completion and the completion date. Reiterate the answer, contractor owns a time risk allowance. If they don't need it, they will earn themselves some more terminal float. Okay?
Excellent. Excellent. Thank you, Richard. John's quickly come back to say, good answer, very happy, and agrees. So thank you for that.
I do like making people happy. That's my day job. Go on.
I've got one more from Nathan, who says, your training is referring to ECC contract, but assume same principles apply for the accepted program under a TSC?
Okay, really good question, and it's not even mentioned on these slides. I do apologise. There's just so much. How much can you put into one presentation? So in the term service contract, which is a contract for a physical service, this is another part of the NEC family of documents. In the term service contract, there is a program requirement for any tasks, TASKS, tasks which are required during the service. So the term service contract has a program for the routine work that's being done, but it has a mechanism for tasks, and each task has its own program. And yes, whoever asked the question, everything in this in slightly different in terms of the language, but not a lot different. Everything in here will also apply to the management of the program for each task in a term service contract. So what we're talking about today is covering ECC, engineering construction contract, PSC, professional services contract, term service contract for tasks. Okay, those three things. All right.
Perfect, thank you.
Brilliant.
Additional questions have come through, but perhaps I'll hold fire until the end for those, Richard.
Okay, let me crack on a little bit, because I have got, as always, I'm not very good at cutting stuff out of presentations. It's one of my problems in life, and I can always see we've got 35 minutes gone already. Okay, let me take over again. Can we do the screen share again? You need to press a button for me, Robert, do you, or have you got my screen already?
No, we've got your screen up and running.
Okay, that's cool. So when you accept the program, you can do that with a defense, the fact that acceptance doesn't change the contractor's obligations or liability, but as a project manager, you should be aware of the client adding in additional client or project manager obligations, particularly client obligations, because if the client doesn't do what it says in the program, ka-ching, compensation event. One little practical tip is that acceptance is a binary thing, yes or no, but good practice, I think, you planners out there, tell me if I'm talking rubbish, it's not a bad idea to say your program's accepted, and I'd like to see a little bit more detail about X, Y, and Z next month. Let's be pragmatic about these things to try and get the program accepted. Oh, bang, crash! Sorry, this is one of the slaps in the NEC contract, and that's my way of waking you up and trying to make this interesting. In the payment aspect clauses, 50.3 or 50.5 in ECC4, the project manager is required to retain 25% of the price for work done to date, which is the spend, the main chunk of money, until the contractor has submitted a first program showing the information which this contract requires. Really subtle clause. It doesn't apply if there was already a program in the contract data part 2, the early discussion on the slides, but it will you can only apply this 25% retention if the contractor either hasn't submitted their first program or has submitted one which you've not accepted because you've said it doesn't show the information which the contract requires. It's a lovely little subtlety of NEC, because those words are directly out of clause 31.3. Those are the reasons for not accepting. So just to be clear, if you not accept the program because you don't think it's practical or not realistic, then you're okay to not accept the program, but you can't then invoke this clause 50.5. Silence is golden because you can read. I'm hoping that most of you can read. That's a line I got from a trainee on a training course I was giving in Belfast 20 years ago. I just love that. I've been using the quote ever since. There are still some people in our industry who act like that. Those people should not be allowed to work on NEC contracts. Simple story. The project manager has got to recognize the benefit of working with the contractor to get to a stage such that we can accept a good enough NEC program. Revising the program. When do we do it? Whenever the PM says so, whenever the contractor chooses. Don't forget, this is just the contractor's little story about how I fancy doing the work. If your scope says I want to build 2 houses, and the first program, even the program included in the contract, says I'll build the big house first and the little house second, if the scope doesn't require the contractor to do it that way, the contractor is perfectly able to say, come in on day one, say, oh, second thoughts, I'll do it the other way round. It's just a warning to you clients out there that you can't rely on the program for the contractor to do it like that. You've got to put any constraints you want in your scope document. Program also gets revised at the interval stated in the contract data, which is typically monthly. And as we'll see a bit later, the program is also used as a markup for a quotation for a particular compensation event. So just the latest story. That's what I've emphasized there on the slide. That revised program shows actual progress, and then in ECC 3, a horrible line, it says implemented compensation events, which some people read that. Implemented in NEC means compensation events where we've done the commercial deal. Nothing to do with whether we've done the work or not, it's the commercial deal. But it's a horrible language, because then people in EC3 days thought, well, oh, we only need to show the compensation events where we've agreed the deal. We don't need to show on the program the other compensation events. That was wrong, because it was just ridiculous. If you don't show the compensation events on your program, and I'm talking just the ones that have been notified and not yet assessed and agreed, your program is not going to be realistic, because you're not showing all those other things which are causing a problem on your contract. Good news is that that's been sorted in NEC 4. Bang! Crash! Big hit. If the contractor doesn't do what they're supposed to do, and if the project manager has not accepted a program, so there is on the record the program has been not accepted for a valid reason stated in the contract, those were the reasons I showed you on a previous slide, bang! The project manager assesses compensation events. This is radical. The project manager doesn't even have to ask for a quotation from the contractor. The impetus, the contract says the project manager assesses. It doesn't say may assess. It says the project manager's job is to assess compensation events. Now, when I give training, and I give an awful lot, I spend half of my life giving NEC training, that's a big surprise to a lot of people who've been doing NEC sort of half-baked for the last 10 years. They don't recognize the importance of that clause 64.1. So if you're doing NEC, go and have a look at 64.1 a bit later. To make this all work, what we don't want to do is sit back and wait for 2 weeks to respond, because in 2 weeks after having received the program, in that 2 weeks, there are going to be more compensation events, more change. What we need to try and get to is a world where day one, we sit down and have the contractor explain the changes in the proposed program. Day two, formal submission. Day three, lovely chubbly, accepted program, move on. I know that's a little bit Nirvana-like, but that's what we need to be trying to work towards, because it's in everybody's interest to have a decent program. Otherwise, we can leave it to those people that the world calls forensic planners, whatever that means. Let's not do that. Let's get on with it and do it on a day-to-day basis. Simple clauses here about access we've sort of talked about. There's also a clause where the PM can instruct a contractor to stop. If they do say that, that will be a compensation event. If you instruct the contractor to stop, it will be a compensation event. But the contract is really subtle, because if that stop was due to a fault of the contractor, for example, because they were flagrantly not complying with health and safety requirements, it's a compensation event, yes, but they won't get any money out of it because it's the fault, underline the word fault, of the contractor. Takeover, the main requirement under NEC is completion by a certain date, and when we can have delay damages against that completion date. And then the employer is required to take over within 2 weeks unless they've said otherwise in the contract data. But they may take over parts of the work, lowercase parts, little bits, before completion. That, though, will normally trigger a compensation event, but only if it's before completion and before the completion date. So if the contractor has gone beyond the completion date, which is when they're supposed to have finished, the employer is allowed under the contract to start taking over without giving the contractor any more time or money. Acceleration is another time-related issue. So very quickly, there's a process for it under clause 36. The only thing you need to take away from this presentation is the words over a barrel. If the client is having to ask for acceleration, which means bringing forward the completion date, the mechanism in the contract allows the contractor to say no. The mechanism in the contract allows the contractor to come up with a ridiculously overinflated budget price for it, and the PM cannot force acceleration. So clients keep well away from acceleration. Instead, my top tip is to use clause 62.1, where for each compensation event, you can ask for alternative quotations, that you can ask for a quotation with and without a delay to the completion date. And therefore, for each compensation event, in discussion with your client, you can basically pay a little bit more money to avoid losing a little bit of time. That's a really good tip if you've got a contract which is seriously program sensitive. Back to the key aspect of the program, it's to do with these compensation events. That's the clause that I've already shown you. The assessment, NEC 4 makes this a lot clearer. NEC 4 has this clause in 63.5. Most importantly, the assessment of the time impact of a compensation event takes into account events which have happened between the date of the accepted program and the dividing date. The dividing date, I haven't yet told you, is effectively the date that a particular compensation event was notified. So the accepted program could be a month, could be 2 months, could be 6 months out of date. And that would be useless for assessing a compensation event. So the contract, it was always there in NEC 3, but it's more explicit in NEC 4. The contract says we take the program at the dividing date and then we update it. There on the slide is the clause in NEC 3 and 4. It says if the program for remaining work is altered. Therefore, when I'm giving training on NEC 3, I have to say to people, well, you can't work out what the effect is on remaining work without first updating the program. But now, because of these words here in 63.5 in NEC 4, it's much clearer. In summary, for each compensation event, start with the accepted program current when it was instructed, in other words, at the dividing date in NEC 4, update to show the remaining work, then add in the compensation event, see if that adding into the compensation event delays the contractor's planned completion. If so, come back to 63.5 here, and then the completion date moves by the same period. That simple process, it's simple for me to say here. Obviously, it's more complicated with a million lines on your program, but NEC actually issued a practice note, 2 or 3 page practice note on that, to which there is a link here in this presentation. Float and time restraints always cause questions. So my example here, we've got little programs. So the normal production rate is that bit, but then as we said earlier, the contractor's also got to include a certain amount of time risk allowance, because there are certain things at the contractor's risk that they need to take to be ready for. And as I've mentioned earlier, the only function of that time risk allowance in the contract is to show to the project manager that this program is, quotes, realistic, which is one of those reasons, remember, for not accepting the program. So that bit there, if I'm on a normal training course, I'll get you to shout out, but we can't do that today. That bit there, the world calls float. That bit there, the world calls terminal float. Now, that's the clause that I keep talking about. If we have a little compensation event here which delays 03, then it's pretty obvious that without doing something different to 03, which is always a possibility, we might ask the contractor to add resources to bring that the duration of 03 to make that shorter. But otherwise, if there is say a 2-week delay in that program, that's clearly going to delay planned completion by that period. And then because of 63.5, that is how much we move back the completion date. Therefore, black and white, the terminal float is clearly owned by the contractor. In contrast, if there's a little compensation event in here, CEO2, and if that does not get in the way of 03, then we will have no impact on planned completion, and therefore we can say that in this scenario, the client has used the float. However, if the contractor, this is where I think I probably have to jump to this format because it's easier to do. That didn't work very well, did it? Hang on a minute, bear with me. Let's go back to there. If when we went to assess that compensation event, if the first thing we did was to update where the contractor was, If the contractor had, for some reason, been delayed on 04, and if it was out here somewhere, if we then, so we do that first, and then we try to add in CEO2, then you will see that plan completion will be delayed. Therefore, it all depends on who gets to it first. So the classic line in NEC training is that the terminal float is owned by the contractor, the other float, this one here, is owned by whoever gets to it first. Somebody in a training course said to me, first come, first served, which I quite like. Push on quickly. Key dates we haven't mentioned. They're affected by compensation events. If you put a date straight in the scope and the contractor misses it, then okay, breach of contract, you can sue for damage, but you've got no clear mechanism for hitting the contractor, collaboratively slapping the contractor for not meeting their obligation. Key dates, remember, are to achieve a stated condition in the contract data. Now, if we have a sectional completion, which is the other way, there's basically two ways of stating a certain thing to be done by a date, key dates and sectional completions. If we have a sectional completion, we can tie it to a delay damage or even a bonus for early completion. If we have, on the other hand, if we have a key date, firstly and critically, the client does not have to take over the work, they only take over a section, but the contractor has to meet the conditions stated in the contract data by a key date. Then slap. If they don't meet that condition by that date, you have to know to go and have a look at clause 25.3. The contractor, if the employer incurs additional cost in carrying out work on the same project because the contractors missed that key date, then the project manager assesses what that cost is and the contractor pays. So that's quite scary from a supplier's perspective because there's no predetermined amount. We don't know how much we're going to get hit if we miss the key date. On the other hand, it only applies if the employer actually carries out work. It's not a global any costs incurred by the employer. It's only if they choose to carry out work because you missed the key date. I could spend half an hour talking about that, but that's enough for tonight. So that's everything I've said today is applicable in principle to both NEC 3 and NEC 4. There's a few important changes in NEC 4. Firstly, there's just a reference, very simple, there's a reference saying the program is to be in the form stated in the scope. That's just a prompt to make sure when somebody writes the scope, they bother to say what form we want the program in, which should be in its native software as a PDF. And if you're like me, on a bloody great piece of paper that I can stick on the wall because I'm a little bit old-fashioned. But you've got to write that in the scope. We've got this clear dividing date, which I've mentioned in the presentation, which is just neater and clearer than was the case in the NEC 3, although it doesn't actually change anything. What I haven't been was really clear. That dividing date separates between actual and forecast. You'll see if you come to a session on compensation events that NEC is radically different and it has forecasts. We have to forecast the effect of the event. And the dividing date is that dividing date between actual and forecast. And we've said to you that already, the big difference now in NEC 4, there's a new clause at the end of 31.3. If the PM is useless and just doesn't respond to a submitted program, the contractor may now give a little prompt, a little tap on the shoulder and say, "Oi, you're flipping useless. You haven't responded within 2 weeks, you numpty." That triggers another week. And if the PM doesn't respond within that further week, the program that they have submitted is now treated as accepted. In other words, deemed acceptance. That mechanism is not there. There is no deemed acceptance of program at all in NEC 3. There is now in NEC 4, but only if the contractor chooses to prompt. There we go. That was it, I think. That's most of my detail. Let's come back to Slido and see if we've got some more questions. Do you think, having listened to all that, the provisions for program in NEC are suitable for a decent sized project? or too hard for you and completely unreasonably onerous? What do you think, people? You're all giving me the right answer so far. That's 18 people. If there's only 18 people left, everybody's gone off and I've gone down the pub by now. General rule, it seems you think it's maybe not such a good or bad idea. But hopefully I've got across to you that the NEC program is a serious beast. Okay, a serious beast. And then we had another question, I think, did we? Okay, having seen all this stuff, if you weren't aware of it before, do you think, having listened to all that, would you get more likely to go to your clients and say, yeah, NEC seems rather good? I can tell you now, if you're using FIDIC or JCT or ICC or IChemE, they have nothing like this, anywhere near like this, in terms of programming stuff. But please understand that you need decent, skilled people to make NEC work. As per my summary slide, which you may or may not be able to see, hopefully Robert will flip it. I think we can see that, Robert, can we? So, okay, show my screen again. One slide summary, program is key. You don't just need a primavera jockey, as we using that word in the industry. You need somebody who understands your project, understands planning. I think generally on a decent sized project, it's a good idea to have a program at the contract date. I think it's critical that you get people to work together to collaboratively update that program each month. And everything I said today is just as important for PSC as it is for the construction contract. I work for Mott MacDonald. We're a major international consultant, and we are learning, just like contractors are learning, that if we're using PSC contracts, which are becoming more and more the norm, we need to up our game when it comes to program. And I think that's probably, I've got a small test, but that small test doesn't really work today. Completion date, plan completion, date of completion. Let's go back to Robert and see if we've got any questions for the last few minutes, or as long as you want to stay. Robert, have we got any more questions out there?
We certainly have, but first off, thank you, Richard, for going through that information and sharing some great information with everyone. And thank you, everyone, for getting involved in the Slidos and the questions throughout. So I might be jumping back a couple of slides here, Richard, so hopefully you can tie the question into the information.
Well, I've got my questions up, so can I go on, carry on?
Yeah, so Ashok has asked, is the PM named in the contract? And what happens if the PM leaves? Is the contract able to be modified with new names, etc.? Is this process quick and easy to do, or could the supplier use this again and ask for something to be added or the change of the name?
Simple answer, 14.4. Clause 14.4 allows the client to change the project manager. And if we do need a change, then that's the clause under which we need to do it. And so the simple answer is yes, the project manager is named. Now, many contracts, because the tender documents are put together way in advance, sometimes the project manager might be named as Mott MacDonald, but then on day one, Mott MacDonald, sorry, I should say in BBC, other consultants are available, but Mott MacDonald has got to nominate an individual to be able to play the role of the project manager. Clearly, it's got to go, the whole thing has got to go to an individual. Okay?
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. So Stephen has asked, what kind of detail will you include when updating the programme in accordance to clause 32?
Okay, well, let's have a look. Let's read the contract, because that's what we need to do. Have people still got my screen or not? Maybe not. Or do I need to show the screen again?
I can do that for you, not a problem.
Okay, showing my screen. God, we're working like a team, aren't we, Robert? I love this. It's brilliant. So we've got two simple clauses for revising the programme. And the contract says that in addition to all the stuff we talked about in 31.2, when we come to update it, we also have to show actual progress achieved on each operation and if it affects on the timing of the remaining work. In other words, we've got to update the programme. We've also got to show how the contractor plans to deal with any delays. So if the contractor is slipping behind programme, then the contractor should show how they're going to try and pull that back. But I should warn you that they will only bother with that if there is some mechanism to give them a contractual slap if they're late. In other words, delay damages. They've also got to show how they're planning to correct notified defects. And don't forget, they can show any other changes that they feel like it, because it's their story. I want you to all go away from this session recognizing that the program is just the contractor's story as to what I'm planning to do. Okay?
Excellent. Thank you, Richard. Jorge has asked, can you please repeat what PWDD stands for? It was on one of your slides on the right-hand side.
I'm sorry. That's me using what I always call a CMA. Do you understand what a CMA is? A CMA is a completely meaningless bloody acronym or completely meaningless abbreviation. I do apologize. PWD is the price for work done to date. It's NEC's label for the main chunk of money that the contractor gets each month. It's the cumulative amount due to the contractor. Good question, and sorry for the CMA.
Excellent, thank you. By the way, people are saying some really nice comments about the information you shared and also the answers you're giving. If you're okay for a couple more questions,
I'm more than happy. Yeah, Karen, just I've got to go and pick up my wife for supper, but she can wait. Don't worry, carry on. It's NEC. It's much more important.
I'll cut that bit out the editing. Just
yeah, please do. Carry on.
So Elodie has asked, if the contractor shows CEs which are not implemented on the program with associated time delays which is not agreed, is this a reason for not accepting the program?
Really, really good question. You know, nobody's asked it, and that's such a blunt question in my 25 years of NEC training. The reasons for not accepting the program are in 31.3, and that is not one of them if those are reasonable POS. The important thing to get to understand is that when the contractor shows those notified but not yet implemented compensation events on the program, yes, it will delay planned completion, but it won't delay the completion date. And even if you've accepted that on the program, it doesn't mean that you're accepting that as the duration that you're accepting for a specific compensation event. Think of it as there's almost a team, there's a program room and there's a compensation event room. So the compensation event room is using the program and updating the program to justify as a markup of a part of the program to demonstrate an entitlement to a certain delay to plan completion. But whatever may have been thrown on the program in advance as a first stab at that compensation event doesn't matter. I hope that explains clearly enough. It's not easy, but I'm hoping that's close enough.
Excellent, thank you, Richard. Perhaps one I'll read it out in full, but John has said, did NEC 4 miss a trick regards dividing date? Dividing date is stated as the date of communication notification. What if the date of the actual delay in event was several weeks earlier than the date of the communication notification, i.e. the accepted program might include several weeks of actual progress after the delay in event. Therefore, this progress needs to be omitted to separate actual from forecast and model the planned completion movement.
That's where I might say, can I take that one away and come back in an email? It's a good point. So remember, as I said to you earlier, the dividing date is the date that the thing was notified. And I'm guessing, I mean, logical in NEC, what everybody from both sides should be doing is notifying as soon as possible, because that then gives everybody the chance to get in there and try and assess that compensation as soon as possible. But we have said, and if you look at that clause 63.5, the new words in 63.5, what it says, and I'm going to switch to it and have a look at it. I'm not going to share it with you. I'll just read it out because I need to check it, because I don't know that one off by heart yet because I'm not that sad. 63.5, the assessment takes into account any delay caused by the compensation event that was already in the program. So I guess that probably answers your question. In other words, we're not going to put that delay in twice. If it's already in the program, we'll take that into account when it comes to assessing the event. Best I can do for that one. That's a really good question, but I probably need a little bit more time to think about that one. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you, John, and thank you, Richard. I think, if you don't mind, I'll do one final question and I'll let you pop off and get get your wife for tea. Mark Anthony has said, hi, what are your thoughts on using assumptions in CEs for time impacts?
Okay, really, really good question. Something we haven't talked about at all today. So NEC has a wonderful clause 61.6, which allows the PM to state assumptions to be used in a particular compensation event. If there are no assumptions stated, then the quotation has to allow for any risk that might come at the contractor. If we state assumptions, then the quotation is based on those assumptions, and only if those assumptions prove to be incorrect do we come back and have another compensation event to look at the effect of those assumptions being incorrect. So if the parties really can't work out how much this might delay completion, it's possible, but messy, to have an assumption, stated assumption, which says this compensation event delays completion by 2 weeks. You write that into your assumption, you assess it as a delay of 2 weeks, and then we wait and see and find out how much it really did delay completion. And then if it delays completion by, it turns out it delays completion by 3 weeks, then we would give the contractor another week. It's possible to do that, but by doing that, you're not using the NEC as it's intended to do, which is to properly keep track as to where the time is really going. But I have seen people do that. In the same way, if you, again, you mustn't, is this being recorded? Because NEC might not like me saying this. If you got a compensation event and you really just can't be bothered to forecast it, you just want to agree, tell you what, let's just pay the real cost. The way to do that and cheat, don't let anybody say I told you so, is to have a project manager's assumption which just says, well, the defined cost of this event is 10 grand, keep records. So you put in a quote for 10 grand, the project manager says yes, we keep records, and if we find out it cost 8, we'll come reduced by 2 grand. If we find out it cost 12, we'll give the contractor another 2 grand. In other words, we've just done a fudge to make your compensation event effectively reimbursable, even if you were under a lump sum contract. Please don't tell anybody I told you that, because NEC would not be, Martin Barnes, God bless him, would be not happy with me sharing that with you. I'll leave you on that one, I think.
I think potentially that's a good place to end this evening.
I think so, before I cause myself any more problems.
Otherwise, my editing team will be very busy tomorrow.
Just Richard, don't worry about the editing, that's just fine.
Yeah, perfect. Richard, it really just leaves me to again say thank you for your time this evening. Thank you for your knowledge, both within the presentation, but with the questions as well. So on behalf of APM, thank you.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. What we did last time, because I was really keen, was actually put together, I don't know whether you, I think you shared my written answers to your questions. I'm probably an idiot to offer to do the same again, but what the hell, we'll do the same again, because I really need to stretch my brain on some of those hard questions that I sort of wimped out a little bit on tonight. So we'll have a look at those. If you can send them through to me, Robert, we'll try and do those. Okay.
That's very kind. So everyone who's joined us this evening, thank you for getting involved. Thank you for the questions. As Richard has mentioned, we'll send the questions that are unanswered through to Richard, and we'll put those on the APM website. We'll also put the recording on this on APM YouTube. You can find the first event on there. And I'll also, just a date for your diary, the 19th of August, Richard has kindly given up his time again to discuss NEC, the next stage on. And also, before you go, remember to download the handout, the NEC, the little book on NEC from Richard as well. But it really just leaves me to say thank you again to Richard. Thank you for everyone for attending tonight. Keep well and enjoy the rest of your evening. Bye for now.
Thank you, Robert. Cheers now. Thanks, everybody.